morning's talk is the subject of secret societies, which is a theme that seems to be indelibly bound up with the occult. There are facts, there are fictions, there are fantasies. Um, Ever since the dawn of internet culture, people have expressed a renewed fascination with ideas and dramas around secret societies, much of it, quite frankly, completely fictional. Um, Much of it in the direction of excitement and sort of the thrill that comes with speculations, rather than dealing with the realities of occult practice here in the West over the past several hundred years, and without dealing with the actual outer realities of our lives, in which all of us, I think from every walk of life, want and expect greater transparency, greater accountability in the institutions that govern our lives: tech, government, financial, and so forth. So the wish to sort of discern a hidden hand behind human events can be very dramatic. It can also be very distracting, because it can lead a person in the direction of the dramatic, of the exciting, of the entertaining, and direct one's gaze away from where it should be if you're a socially concerned or politically concerned person, which is the individual's own choice. We should be understanding institutions that we live within and whether these institutions are demonstrating appropriate accountability or transparency. And if not, why not? Why not? But the idea of the secret society as a power center has been very tantalizing across the arc of modern occult history. And there are, of course, real secret societies. We've mentioned some of them this weekend. Not all of them still exist. Not all of them ever existed at all in any clear way. They might have been thought movements or just literary movements that didn't really have an authentic nucleus of people around them. So I've mentioned Rosicrucianism, the Illuminati, which I'll say more about, Freemasonry, and of course, the Theosophical Society itself, for many, many years, had its own esoteric section. That may still be the case. A great scholar who I admire and who was an inspiration on me, P.D. Uspensky, was invited to join the esoteric section. It wasn't particularly for him. Gandhi, as I mentioned in one of yesterday's talks, although he loved Theosophy and spoke glowingly of Theosophy throughout his life, he felt, at least at that time, that there was a certain secrecy within the organization, so he declined to be part of it. I've been part of groups that maintained a certain degree of, I'm not going to go so far as to say secrecy, but a concern with privacy, a concern with discreetness, and sometimes I feel that's necessary, and sometimes I feel it's exaggerated. We're often told, mostly in popular books of occult literature, that the mystery traditions of the ancient world and the initiatory traditions and the traditions that have been maintained by occult groups that tend towards secrecy in the modern age have been engineered to keep the sacred away from the eyes of the profane. And I think that gets repeated too often. I think that's a kind of off-the-shelf idea. But I do realize and I do understand that there are certain ideas and concepts that I think can get easily diluted if they're talked about too readily or too freely, or if they're misunderstood and kind of construed into other terms or language that may depart from the original idea itself. Very often when you talk about an esoteric idea to someone, maybe a friend or a colleague or a family member or what have you, who's not necessarily involved on the path with you, you'll often hear people saying, oh, I get it, it's like this or it's like that. You know, they start to reach for um, analogies or commonalities so that they can reframe an idea in a manner that's familiar to them. And as a philosopher friend of mine once put it, speaking of the ideas of specifically of G.I. Gurdjieff, it's not like anything. It's not like anything. There are certain ideas that can't just be reframed or restated into more familiar language. So, to some extent, I don't think that's an argument necessarily in favor of secrecy, but one does want to be careful and thoughtful about the extent to which spiritual ideas or psychological insights are shared or overshared, because I think a certain degradation and a certain dilution can settle in. And sometimes, in fact, an individual has to sit with an idea, him or herself, for a long time until it starts to be meaningful. You know, words can really dissipate impact. Um, I have found it to be true that there is a certain personal power in silence. In fact, very often we seek to relieve ourselves of negative emotions, of difficult feelings by sharing them. And there's probably some usefulness to that and some necessity to that. Sometimes things do need sharing. But we have to remember that not infrequently in those cases where we're speaking about something that might be negative, that might be emotionally difficult for us to another person, a friend or a counselor, a therapist, whatever, we're doing that with the intention of diluting the difficult feeling. The actual exchange somehow seems to emotionally dilute what we're experiencing, and that's valid. That's valid. But we have to watch out for that process as well, because when you experience something with a degree of profundity, rushing to share it, rushing to put it into words that can translate it to another, I believe can also enact the same process of dilution. So there is something to be said for silence. There is something to be said for privacy. I think that it's important to point out before I dive into a little bit of the historicism around the question of secret societies that there are, of course, cartels and groups and communities of mutual interest that get together, and it's human nature. We are power-seeking beings, often unwisely, and there's no question that there are enclaves, fraternities, gatherings that are for the elite, and sometimes not so elite, who use these things to perpetuate their own interests. I would also say that ours is a world globally in which digital commerce and the movement of finance without regard to borders or without regard to even anything that's actually real at the back of finance other than perception, can create enormous concentrations of power, enormous shifts in power, and can do so literally overnight. I mean, look at the Great Recession of 2008, from which I don't think our country ever really fully recovered. I mean, I remember vividly when the Great Recession was unfolding here in New York City. I mean, I knew certain people who were partners at banks, and they were rushing into their office on Sunday morning, absolutely shell-shocked and in disbelief at what was happening. You know, I mean, here was the global economy melting down. Banking giants like Bear Stearns were tottering. Bear Stearns eventually went out of business. The government was coming up with ways to interject massive loans and financial resources into the banking system in order to prop it up. And this was due largely to the fallout of a mortgage crisis in which there were a very wide range of financial entities, many private banks, some quasi-governmental organizations like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that were giving out junk mortgages to people that they couldn't possibly repay. And then these junk mortgages were being repackaged into enormous securities products which were being sold back and forth throughout the global financial structure. And eventually became apparent that the emperor had no clothes, that these repackaged, bundled mortgages were just junk loans that nobody could repay. Confidence plummeted in the market. Billions of dollars were lost literally overnight. But what does lost mean when money is nothing other than digits, that flash on a screen and that have value basically based on the psychology, the mass psychology of the financial system. And where else today does value come from? What is cryptocurrency? Well, there's certainly no such thing as a gold standard anymore. And loans and sums of money and capital flow every place without resources to necessarily back any of this stuff up. So when we speak in terms of power, that's where power is really vested. And, it's very hard to track, and it's very hard to control, and it's very hard to understand, and it's very hard to manage. These are real things, and then, of course, we have to ask ourselves, well, what are our right policies to have in our world today? What do we want in a healthcare system? Are we satisfied with private healthcare? Should we have a Canadian-style system? What's the plus and minus of this and that? There's all kinds of questions. And I'm not on some political trip where I want to prescribe to anybody the answers to that. People have their own values, their own needs, their own perceptions. And it's for the individual to determine, what should be done about X, Y, Z. We want to have intelligent policies. We want to have transparent policies. We want to have policies that are going to deliver on one hand without taking, on the other. And it's a balance, and it's not necessarily easy. So this is the politics I view out there in the world. However, this does not excite people terribly much on late night radio, and it does not excite people terribly much on Twitter, and it does not excite people terribly much on, all kinds of digital shows and programs and blogs and podcasts where it's much more exciting to talk about hidden figures in a star chamber somewhere manipulating our world. And of course, there are figures, powerful figures, who engage in manipulations, probably in the same measure that there are such figures in the more ordinary environs of life. But that in itself, in my estimation, doesn't get you to a constructive view of the world. In fact, when people are searching for some sort of hidden hand or hidden enemy, not infrequently, the people who kind of pay the price for that are not the rich and the powerful. They're everyday people. They may be theosophists who are misunderstood as being some sort of, secretive occult force. Or, somebody will come along and say, hey, this Madame Blavatsky you like so much, she had a journal called Lucifer at the end of her life. You guys are the problem. I mean, believe me, this stuff comes home really, really quickly. That's why I really encourage people not to get into the kind of mindset of like searching for hidden hands. Not because they're always necessarily wrong, and not because I want to tell somebody else what to do, but the historical pattern is that if you search for a hidden foe, and that's a habit of thought, you will find one. You will find one. And the overwhelming likelihood is the foe that gets found, again, according to historical pattern, is usually found among the weak or the helpless. People who were killed in witch trials in Europe were not well-to-do people. They were poor people, women often isolated, people who were harassed and tormented and wrongly subjected to law enforcement or prosecution during the so-called satanic panic of the 1980s and 90s. They were not wealthy people, It wasn't Jeffrey Epstein or, anything close. It was, everyday folks, maybe a librarian who wears a pentagram around his or her neck, and suddenly a whisper campaign begins, something like that. So this stuff can come home very quickly, and it usually comes home to people who are completely just innocent people, bothering nobody. So I like to be really, really careful with the whole secret society thesis because I think it gets out of hand very quickly. Now, the fact is, yes, historically there have been secret societies, and I take a different view of them than is often heard within popular media. As I was alluding in a couple of our earlier talks, during the backlash against the occult revival of the Renaissance, um, people who were interested in religious experimentation or were interested in forms of spirituality that broke away from the church were subject to a lot of danger as the Renaissance gave way to the 1600s. I mean, maybe in some sense the Renaissance could be seen as having ended, at least informally, with the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1607. Queen Elizabeth in Britain, I wouldn't say she was an esotericist, but she did tend to offer protection to people who were involved in the esoteric arts. In particular, one of her court magicians and astrologers was the great John Dee, and soon after her death, Dee was sent into exile where he died. So I think there were organizations and groups who said to themselves, in order to continue to experiment with occult or esoteric ideas, a degree of secrecy is going to become necessary. And this was felt in 1617 in Central Europe when there appeared in German a manuscript called the Fama, or Our Fraternity. And this manuscript, which started to circulate in Central Europe in 1617, was the first work, the first of three manuscripts that were attributed to the so-called Rosicrucian Brotherhood. And the Rosicrucian Brotherhood stated that it was an invisible college, a very alluring phrase. It was an invisible college of seekers and artists and people with democratic inclinations who wanted to create and establish a new era of religious experimentation and public learning, and who wanted to establish free hospitals for the poor and educational opportunities for the poor, who wanted to separate church power from state power, and who honored all religions, who practiced a kind of radical ecumenism that respected all different faiths. Sounds a little bit like, Theosophy. And so when this manuscript appeared, people were thrilled. They thought, wow, who is this invisible college? Who are these people who profess an interest in occult symbolism, esoteric knowledge, spiritual search, radical ecumenism, protection of liberty, protection of free speech, separation of church and state. About a year later, another manuscript in German, attributed to the same Rosicrucian order, began to circulate through Europe. That was called the Confession of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. And it was sort of a further extrapolation of some of these themes. And the final manuscript appeared in I believe it was 1617, which was called The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. And the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz was an allegory, was a religious allegory of a young man who was called to a castle to perform a wedding. And it was basically a symbolic exploration of alchemy, of psychological alchemy, of joining feminine and masculine psychical qualities, of joining material and ethereal, chemical and earthly qualities, of creating within the psychology of the individual a greater, more developed, more refined iteration of human nature, of a completed man and woman, of a kind of genderless, boundaryless, illumined being who could see through life to its greatest cosmic truths. So that was the chemical wedding of Christian Rosicrucians. So between 1614 and 1617, these three manuscripts electrified Central Europe, and there was this idea ignited that the Rosicrucians were this invisible fraternity, this invisible college of beneficent occult seekers who not only wanted to extol the spiritual search, but to protect it and to reform society in such a way that no church authority, no monarchical authority could control or shut down the spiritual search, and they wanted to provide some sort of a social polity that would provide hospitals for the sick, education for the willing, and religious freedom for seekers. Now, one hears the term Rosicrucian used everywhere today. Was there even a Rosicrucian brotherhood? We don't know. That's an open question. It's possible that the people who wrote these manuscripts, and certainly someone wrote them, were disgruntled followers of John Dee, who were trying to reestablish their vision in society, but under the veil of a kind of secrecy. But we really don't know. The claim of there being an invisible college is a very alluring and exciting claim. It's a claim in a certain sense, depending on your perspective, that you want to believe. And even the person who's afraid of it wants to believe it, because we define ourselves by finding enemies. We define ourselves by who we're excluding. So some people hear the idea of an invisible college, and it gets their imagination going. I want to belong to this. Who are these people? How can I make contact with this? Some people hear this and they're threatened by it, and they're bothered by it, and they think, I found my enemy. We're going to find this invisible college, fix these guys. Now today, and this has been true, since the early 19th century, there are a variety of groups, some Freemasonic affiliated, some independent, who claim the title of Rosicrucian, and they'll all tell you the same thing, which is that they have some ancient charter or some lineage that dates them back to the specific Rosicrucian order, and they're the real McCoy. Again, we don't even know if there was a real McCoy to begin with. All we really have from that particular period of history are three manuscripts, and some written in German, some written in Latin, in which, we are being told that there is this extant invisible college, this brotherhood. But all we have is the literary claim and the inspiration. But interestingly enough, what we do start to find within a few years of the publication of The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosicrucians, what we start to find early on in the 1600s are references in diaries and in literature to another kind of an initiatory order, and that is the Freemasonic order. Probably the earliest really solid concrete reference to Freemasonry as an initiatory group can be found in 1646 in the diaries of a British esotericist and antiquarian named Elias Ashmole. And Ashmole wrote in his diaries in 1646 that he was specifically initiated into a Freemasonic lodge, and he talks about some of the rites and rituals. And it's very valuable because although we do have earlier references to Freemasonry, this is the first, clearest, most explicit reference to a Freemasonic initiation, to the existence of an actual concrete lodge of seekers. And the Ashmole diaries spell all this out in a manner that's explicit and that's unmistakable. So we start to see less than 20 years following the emergence of the Rosicrucian literature, the establishment of a lodge that sounds a lot like Rosicrucianism in its stated values and its manuscripts. One can speculate forever as to the actual history of Freemasonry. Masonry as an organization has produced many, many very, very capable and able scholars. It's produced a wonderful range of scholarly historicism that seeks to document and probe its own backgrounds, but there is not consensus, even within Freemasonry itself, as to the nature of the group's origins. That may be the only group in modern life for which that is the case. Some people will say most fancifully, well, we go back to the stone guilds that, built Solomon's temple. Well, we have no historicism that really supports that. We don't even have historicism that definitively supports the existence of a King Solomon, much less an order within Solomon's hierarchy. And then others will say, well, we go back to the stone-cutting guilds of the Middle Ages that built the cathedrals. Possible. And then another argument is, and I tend to favor this one, that there probably is some thought connection between the emergence of Freemasonry in the mid-1600s and the ideals that were communicated in the Rosicrucian manuscripts. There's probably some line of connection there. Now, even for all this, Masonry itself did not emerge as an above-ground institution until 1717 with the formation of the Grand Lodge of England. That marked the first time, not very long ago, that Masonry as an above-ground institution was identifiable and identified itself. And as I've alluded earlier, and I won't go over that material in any great detail right now, there were an outsized number of Freemasons among the founders here in the United States. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, Paul Revere, an outsized number of Washington's generals, an outsized number of the framers of the Constitution, an outsized number of the signers of the Declaration were Freemasons. And that's a very, very big deal. That is a very big deal. Because Masonry was, without question, one of the vessels of thought that helped to frame some of the best of the founding articles of this country. The bitter irony, of course, is that at that same time, we were experiencing the destruction of the Native American culture and the enslavement of countless numbers of people who were held in bondage in the brutalest of conditions for centuries. It's so contradictory, but this is how history is. Here you have these articles of religious freedom that are, I think it's fair to say, Freemasonic influenced, that are setting a standard that allows us to function like this today, and at the same time, you have horrific crimes going on concurrently. Human nature is extremely confounding and extremely polarized, and it can be very frustrating, and it can be very difficult for people to sort out. A friend of mine told me years ago that when you're on the spiritual path, you absolutely must have the ability to sustain paradox. And if you don't have the ability to sustain a sense of paradox, you're going to get torn apart. And this is one of the real challenges, I think, of our educational system, and it's really tough. It's really tough to sort of communicate to kids that you won't get at an understanding of the world by being absolutely certain that, here's the bad guys, here's the good guys, and of course I, the observer, am always on the side of the good guys. It's very simple. And using a kind of language and a kind of like historical framing that that is based on absolutes. It's not that I don't want people to make moral judgments. I do. But there is so much contradiction in our world because that seems to be the nature of life. Hermetic literature gives us the expression as above, so below. That can be understood on many levels. But I think one of the levels on which that must be understood is that life does polarize. Life does exist as a kind of polarity. So you can have a figure like Thomas Jefferson, for example, not a Freemason, but who was an enormous architect of religious liberty, and yes, who also owned slaves. And the contradiction is powerful. But that same contradiction can tear you apart if you don't learn to understand that there is a paradoxical quality to life, including to my life, including to my life. You know, when we look back on these historical figures, again, it's human nature. I'm always on the side of the good guys. I'm always Luke Skywalker, never Darth Vader. You know, I mean, that's how we all view ourselves. It's the blindness of human nature. So we have to locate ourselves within that paradox as well. Now, I mentioned Thomas Jefferson. He was a defender of a group that is often associated with nefarious activities and that does not today exist, and that is the Illuminati, the famous Illuminati, which is a sort of a stand-in word for, you know, every hidden chamber or organization that's supposed to have people in black robes drinking blood from a skull or, you know, something of that nature, and messing with our lives in ways that don't result in any good. As a matter of historical fact, the Illuminati was formed in Bavaria in the year 1776 by a lawyer, an occult experimenter named Adam Weishaupt. And Adam Weishaupt believed that Freemasonic lodges themselves could be used as revolutionary vehicles. Weishaupt was a revolutionary in the same sense that the best of the founders were. Like Thomas Jefferson, he believed ardently in separation of church and state. He believed that the edifice of the church should be completely disestablished from government. He believed that rank and privilege should be eliminated in favor of merit, and of course he saw himself and his colleagues as the exemplars of merit. So there's another danger in human nature. And he had friends within the artistic and intellectual spectrum of Central European society at that time, including the composer Mozart and the philosopher Goethe. And what Weishaupt attempted to do was to form in the Illuminati a kind of renegade Freemasonic movement, which itself would seek to infiltrate Freemasonic lodges and remake them into vehicles of political protest or revolution, or vehicles that would undermine the prevailing political order. So, you know, I admire Weishaupt in one sense in terms of his principles and aims. I personally, I suppose I side with Gandhi. I don't think secrecy is ultimately a vehicle of good politics. So the idea of secretly infiltrating lodges and turning them into vehicles of political protest, which is something that 150, 160 years later, the Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin endorsed, that's not something that I think is conducive to democratic politics. I don't think you can get to a proper solution by employing means and methods that contradict that very solution. So, you know, I suppose I say, I think Weishaupt and the Illuminati have been misunderstood, but there was an element of secrecy there that was probably contradictory to some of the democratic aims that the group claimed to its own belief system. Now, in I think it was maybe in 1800, Jefferson wrote a letter in which he defended Adam Weishaupt. He defended him a couple of times and said, look, you know, the aims of the Illuminati are not much different than the aims of many of us here who have framed the Constitution and other American documents. It's just that Weishaupt lives in a society where democratic political agitations are punished by law or prohibited by law, and if he lived here in the new republic of the United States, he would not have had to adopt that level of secrecy. So that was Jefferson's defense of Weishaupt and the Illuminati. The fact is, the aristocratically based government of Bavaria passed laws against secret societies soon after the advent of the Illuminati, which resulted in the group being probably completely shut down within 8 or 9 years of its existence. The scent trail of any legitimate documentation or historicism pretty much stops there. The Bavarian laws were very oppressive. They had secret police forces. They were the government, which was a church-state aristocratic compact, was hell-bent on eliminating the Illuminati as a revolutionary organization, and probably succeeded in doing so. And yet, rumors of this secret brotherhood persisted so much into the present day that you'll hear people speculating as to whether Lady Gaga was using Illuminati symbolism during her Super Bowl halftime show or something like that, which would be a strange way for a secret society to wink and nod at its other members. Everyone from Jay-Z to Pope Francis and so on and so forth is said to be members of something called the Illuminati today. It's just this great sprawling metaphor that people use for some hidden organization. This probably came about because after the French Revolution in 1784, there were certain pamphleteers who wrote that the Illuminati Brotherhood was still intact and was the force behind the French Revolution. And the same theory got revived with the Russian Revolution in the early 1900s. I think it's difficult for people to believe sometimes that a social order that was so familiar, such as the aristocracy in France or the Tsarist regime in Russia, could just vanish seemingly overnight. Of course, nothing really happens overnight in that regard. There are social pressures that are building and building for a long time. There are irreconcilable conflicts that eventually boil over. Governments that don't have popular support are kind of like houses built on a foundation of sand. And yet, when revolutions do occur, such as in France, such as in Russia probably more of a civil war than a revolution, it can be shocking that the prevailing order can vanish so quickly. And yet, just a little earlier in this talk, I was describing how I watched and you watched a prevailing financial order seem to vanish very quickly during the 2008 recession. That was, of course, a very different situation, but factors that had been building up for several decades, deregulation on certain types of Wall Street trading, shorting of stocks, bad loans, predatory lending, bundling and rebundling of bad loans into securities packages. All of this led to a vulnerability that completely exploded over the course of a single weekend in 2008. And if the U.S. government had not infused the banking system with massive amounts of relief resources, the banking system as we know it wouldn't exist. And we don't know what the global consequences of that would have been. So stuff can change very dramatically and very suddenly in a very short space of time. And it's so mysterious when this occurs, even though the factors are always there. It can be easier. It can be just easier to blame a hidden hand. And that's what happened with the Illuminati after the French Revolution, and that narrative never really went away. And the church always had a certain animus towards not only the Illuminati, but Freemasonry, which it saw as a kind of competing power center. In fact, as recently as 1983, the man who became Pope Benedict issued a ruling from the church's Office of the Doctrine of the Faithful, which was the old inquisitory arm of the church, stating that church members should not be Freemasons, that Freemasonry was not an acceptable organization. Well, I have family members who are also Catholic, who are Freemasons, so that dictum does not always get followed in in practice, but as late as 1983, the church was issuing that in principle, that a member of the Catholic Church cannot be a Freemason. So, there are many reasons why these perceptions persist. Another reason is sometimes people will hear a phrase that seems to them to capture something about the clandestine wielding of power. And one such phrase that attracted a lot of speculation until fairly recently, when it was overtaken by Deep State, was the phrase New World Order. New World Order. What is this creepy phrase, New World Order? The fact is, on the back of our U.S. dollar bill, there is what I regard as that beautiful, alluring symbol of the eye hovering above the pyramid, surrounded by the Latin slogan, Annuit Septis Noos Ordo Seclorum, which can be loosely translated as God or Providence smiles on our new order of the ages. Now that symbol of the eye and pyramid and that Latin maxim that surrounds it is part of the Great Seal of the United States. It's the reversal of the Great Seal of the United States. The front of the Great Seal has the more familiar American eagle holding both olive branches and arrows in its claws. And that symbol tended to be more familiar to Americans for many years. But in fact, in June of 1776, the new colonial Congress was charged with creating a seal, an insignia for the new republic. And Benjamin Franklin, a Freemason, chaired a committee that was charged with designing this new seal, and the Great Seal was unveiled in 1781. And again, it had the more familiar American eagle on the front and the more mysterious eye and pyramid on the back. Most Americans had not really seen the reverse of the Great Seal. It was used for official business and documents. It wasn't something that was widely seen by the public, but that changed in 1935 when Franklin Roosevelt, president and a Freemason, worked with his Secretary of Agriculture, a man named Henry Wallace, who will be recognizable to many of you as not only a Freemason, but also a Theosophist. He would have had a good time being with us this weekend, I'd like to believe. Henry Wallace was a great man. Henry Wallace was FDR's Secretary of Agriculture at that time, probably one of the best secretaries of agriculture this nation has ever had. He saved countless family farms during the Great Depression. Later, he became FDR's vice president. He was his second vice president. The first vice president was a Texan named John Nance Gardner, and he had a falling out with FDR. Henry Wallace became FDR's second vice president, and FDR's third vice president, the man, of course, who succeeded him and who's known to history, it was Harry Truman. But Henry Wallace, who was a Freemason, who was a Theosophist, who was a lifelong mystical seeker, was very instrumental in the Iron Pyramid being placed on the back of the dollar bill. He felt that Americans at that time needed inspiring symbols that would reconnect them with the best ideals of the country's founding. And he felt that this, the reverse of the Great Seal, was one of those symbols. The meaning of it, which is probably influenced by Freemasonry, is that worldly achievement, the pyramid, is incomplete without the eye of Providence, this floating eye above the pyramid. And the idea that Providence smiles on our new order of the ages, that was probably a Latin line from a drama written by Virgil, but this idea that there was a new order of the ages was, I think, the founders' way of trying to associate the New Republic with the great chain of civilizations that had extolled the spiritual search: Greece, Rome, Egypt. And it very, very consciously adopted, and you can see this in some of our national monuments today, Egyptian and Hellenic architecture as representative of the goals and aims of the New Republic. So you see the example right there in the reverse of the Great Seal. There's the pyramid. What is Washington Monument? The obelisk. Greek Egyptian columns and architecture can be found throughout the nation's capital and in many of our state houses. This was the ideal. So, Henry Wallace, our Theosophist Secretary of Agriculture, approaches FDR and says, I think we should mint a new coin of this Great Seal of the United States. And FDR does him one better and says, rather than mint a coin, why don't we actually put this symbol on the back of the dollar bill where people can really
Get
see
back.
it?
Get in there.
Somebody's not muted. I'm sorry, I'm getting some noise in my headphones. And so FDR personally supervised the placement of the Great Seal on the back of the dollar bill, and he actually, and we have his own records in handwriting from records that exist within the U.S. Treasury Department. He actually supervised the placement of the eye and pyramid on the back of the dollar bill. We have pencil records which show that FDR, he took, let me see if I have a dollar bill with me so I could explain to you exactly where I'm coming from. Yes, I do. Here's our familiar dollar bill. I don't know if you can see this on camera, so you'll have to forgive me if it's not coming through clearly. But FDR actually, in his own handwriting in pencil, took the initial early designs of the U.S. dollar bill, and he moved the order of the pyramid from over here on what would be the right-hand side to over here to the left-hand side. He put the pyramid in the more primary position because we read in English from left to right. So left, in the sense of the travel of the eye, is first. And so he actually put the eye and pyramid in the more primary position on the back of the dollar bill. But until that all occurred in 1935, most Americans probably hadn't seen this symbol of the eye and pyramid, didn't hear anything about New Order of the Ages or anything. And for a long time, that phrase kind of wasn't widely circulated. But in the early 1990s, that phrase, New Order or New Order of the Ages, New World Order, got reintroduced into the public consciousness by President George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush, in prosecuting the first Gulf War, spoke twice in front of joint sessions of Congress, once at the start of the war and once at the end of the war. And in both speeches, Bush made reference to the period following the war as potentially being a new world order of commerce and exchange and so forth. And the early digital culture got hold of Bush's use of this phrase, New World Order. And that became a kind of catchphrase for everything that was secret and nefarious. One doesn't hear that so much anymore. Now the phrase deep state is more the phrase that's used in that way. But that was how New World Order kind of came to summarize people's fears of there being this internationalist conspiracy that was up to no good. Freemasonry also ran into its own scandals here in the United States, which made it the subject of speculation and hostility. In the year 1826, there was a Freemason named William Morgan living in central New York State in the Burned Over District, a place I've mentioned a couple of times over the course of our weekend. And Morgan was a disgruntled Freemason who was threatening to publish a manuscript that would expose Freemasonry's rituals and secrets. And Morgan was harassed by the courts and law enforcement, and later he disappeared, and he was dredged out of a lake with his hands tied behind his back. He had been murdered. And there was intense speculation that Morgan's murder was committed and covered up by Freemasonic cells within U.S. law enforcement. And so there began, in the wake of the Morgan affair, a huge backlash against Masonry in the United States. the backlash, again, things always have a complex of causes. It's never just one thing. The Morgan affair and the suspicion that Morgan had been murdered by Freemasons who had been protected by fellow Masons in law enforcement or in the courts, that was the ignition point. That was the ignition point. But there was a general feeling at that time that that American society was riddled with corruption, and that there were elites who were remaking and controlling the society in ways that sequestered all the goodies for them. And people were very serious and concerned about this. That's what led to the election of President Andrew Jackson. President Andrew Jackson was seen as a kind of a man of the people who would come in and clean house. Now, the irony is, Andrew Jackson himself was a Freemason. But nonetheless, Jackson was seen as a guy who was going to come in and get rid of these Freemasons and get rid of these elites and kind of straighten things out for the everyday person. So, there was a general concern in the country about corruption and about privilege. But it was the Morgan affair that really ignited that and that made Masonry, in a sense, into a stand-in for people's concerns. So, Masonry, while it remained popular, it never really wielded as much political clout in the United States again. I mean, you'd find it hard to believe, but the truth is, after 1826, I mean, there developed anti-Masonic political parties, anti-Masonic newspapers, massive anti-Masonic political movements. Masonry was really under fire in the United States. And I would say it recovered without question, but it never again wielded serious political power. It's often said that there are outsized numbers of presidents who were Freemasons, and that is true. Although the last U.S. president who was a full-fledged Freemason was none other than the mysterious Gerald R. Ford. Since then, there haven't been any Masons in the White House. Bill Clinton was involved in a Masonic youth group, but he never fully took Masonic rites. Lyndon Johnson was involved in some Masonic groups, but he never fully took Masonic rites. And since that time, there hasn't been anybody in the White House who was a Freemason. Masonry itself has shrunken in membership, as all organizations have across the United States. We are no longer a nation of joiners. At one time we were, but that's been displaced by social media, among other things. It's probably also been displaced by the fact that people are working much longer hours, which makes it hard for them to be joiners. I want to say one last word about secret societies. Every group, every organization reflects whatever local prejudices it comes from. So there are no angels, in this story. There were Freemasonic lodges that did honor the ideals of Freemasonry, a kind of radical ecumenism, an openness to all members. There were plenty of Freemasonic lodges that were ardently segregated and prejudicial. There was no determining, the behavior of a different group or a different lodge based upon its stated principles, in the same way that there's no determining the behavior of a given religious institution based upon its stated principles. Human nature prevails. Human nature prevails. And in its corruption and in its dubious motives, it's going to appear and show up within secret societies, but also the best of human nature shows up within so-called secret societies. And I want to close on this story. In 1778, there was a freed man of color, an ex-slave, named Prince Hall, who was a leather worker in Boston. And the story once went that in 1775, Prince Hall founded his own Freemasonic order, but some very, very good historians within Freemasonry, named John Hairston and Oscar Allende, have uncovered documents that determine that this Freemasonic order that Prince Hall assembled was not founded in 1775, which is a date that prevailed for a long time, but was founded rather in 1778. Prince Hall, in short, received a Freemasonic charter from an ex-British Army officer who probably was not authorized to grant such a charter, but history can be very messy. And Prince Hall and about 30 of his African American brethren around the city of Boston formed in 1778 a Freemasonic lodge called African Lodge Number 1. And African Lodge Number 1 was the first African American Freemasonic lodge in the United States in world history, and later came to be known by the name of its founding Grand Master Prince Hall as Prince Hall Masonry, which continues today as a predominantly African American co-Masonic order. It's not strictly considered part of mainstream Masonry, but I think that the two organizations are finding ways to more and more get together. Now, interestingly enough, Prince Hall's signature appears on two of the earliest petitions in favor of abolitionism that circulated in the American colonies. The first one in 1775, the second one in 1778. Prince Hall's signature appears on these petitions that call for the dissolution of slavery. And in that vein, and I want to make this very clear, Prince Hall Masonry became the first, basically, African American led abolitionist institution in America. The first black-led abolitionist movement in America was Freemasonic in nature. And I think it's important that people understand that because, again, as much as every organization rises to the heights or sinks to the depths of whatever local attitudes and outlooks are, and that's a universal human truth, it's important for us to realize that when the individual embarks on a deeply personal, intimate spiritual search, the discovery of fuller dimensions within you as an individual very often leads to an expectation, a noble expectation, of fuller dimensions that can be expressed by you in the outer world as well. And very often you will see a kind of marriage between the rise of an esoteric spirituality and the rise of a civic outlook that extols and honors the worth and value of the individual, because you cannot have one without the other. And so in that vein, I would say the history of secret societies, as I've been describing them, while it is as varying as the ups and downs of human nature, I would say the overall historical drift has been in the direction of human dignity, religious equality, and the protection of the individual spiritual search, which I think is the most important principle to defend in our society today. So I thank you so much. It has been such a privilege and such a pleasure to be with you over the course of this conference. It's important to me to be able to speak in this way to brother and sister seekers. It's always meaningful. And we have some time, of course, for questions or exchange. So I'll hand things over to Barbara, and I'm happy to engage with whatever is on your mind.
If anybody has a question, please type it in the chat box. Mitch, I'd like to ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
There have been secret societies or secret groups in our own government
Mhm.
which have gotten out of control in terms of people mythicize about them and what they did. One of the groups I'm thinking of is Majestic 12. Are you familiar with it and can you comment on it?
I'm not familiar with it. I mean,
It has to do with UFOs.
yeah, one has to be super, super careful, I think, with regard to, identifying the historical reality of this or that group. There is secrecy in our society, there is secrecy in government, there's secrecy in finance. I'm more concerned than anything today, I think, probably with questions of surveillance. Um, I don't know anything about Majestic 12. I have not heard of it. I'll take a look into it. I would just always caution extreme sobriety when evaluating the existence of such groups.
I'm looking for more questions. Please comment on the trilateral group.
Again, I think that
That's
you
from
have,
Jamshed.
yeah, thank you. Trilateral group, Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg Group, um, Bohemian Grove, Skull and Bones. You have all kinds of fraternities and orders that are open to and available to an elite few. Um, the question of whether there's actually policy making going on in these organizations is kind of a moving target. I think some of these organizations probably had greater power, quite frankly, in past eras than they do today. I mean, um, the economic might or the economic power, for example, that's vested in Amazon, which has increased dramatically during the period of this lockdown. Um, the economic power invested in companies like those who own Zoom, which we're using during this weekend, has increased enormously. And the capacity of those organizations to set policy that affects all of us is massive. So, when you talk about Bilderberg or Davos or Trilateral or Council on Foreign Relations, I think, quite frankly, power centers don't announce themselves with names, and I think that some of these groups may have been more influential in the 1950s, 60s, 70s than they are today. I think today there's an edifice of unbelievably concentrated financial power within tech, pharmaceuticals, banking, natural gas, natural energy, natural resources. I think that's where the power centers are.
Doss McDavid asked a question. Can you comment on Nicholas Roerich and his relation to Henry Wallace and FDR?
Sure. Nicholas Roerich was a theosophist and an artist um, who kind of branched off and founded his own movement in Europe and the United States called Agni Yoga in, let's see, I guess it would be the 1920s, 1930s. And he was a very powerful, very influential figure who I guess you could say he was a kind of renegade theosophist. I mean, he was very honoring of HPB and he loved philosophy, but he also saw himself as a kind of self-appointed avatar who could make contact anew with the hidden masters and adepts. And in fact, here in New York City, where I live on the upper west side of Manhattan, there's a building called the Master Apartments. It's at Riverside Drive and West 104th Street, which was designed by Nicholas Roerich. And when he said master, he wasn't kidding. He designed this apartment building to be a kind of headquarters to which Master Moria could return and usher in a new age of spiritual understanding and world harmony. And so Roerich founded this building, this skyscraper, which is now called the Master Apartments. It used to be called the Master Studios. And the idea was at the top, was an apartment, was a studio where Master Moria was supposed to return and sort of preside over this beneficent New World Order. A friend of mine, not long ago, snuck to the top of that building and took some pictures. And there's nothing up there, I'm afraid, but old carpentry supplies, discarded plywood, and lattice work. But Roerich was a great kind of impresario and a very powerful figure who met Franklin Roosevelt while he was governor of New York State, and who, for a time, became connected to Henry Wallace while he was Secretary of Agriculture. And Wallace viewed Nicholas Roerich for a period of time as a kind of mentor, and he wrote a series of letters to Roerich where he addressed him as Dear Guru. And these letters, in short, resurfaced when Wallace himself was attempting a third party a bid for the presidency. Wallace was running against Harry Truman at the time. And these letters resurfaced, and they very severely embarrassed Wallace and probably really reduced the vigor and the efficacy of his third-party presidential campaign, marked the end of his political career. I write about this in detail in Occult America, but Wallace had a very fraught relationship with Nicholas Roerich. He paid for Nicholas Roerich to go on ostensibly an agricultural mission to parts of Southeast Asia, where Wallace was supposed to be gathering drought-resistant strains of grass. But that apparently was not exciting enough for Nicholas Roerich. He was not there for the purposes of scientific agriculture. What Roerich wound up doing on this mission that Wallace had funded in his capacity of Secretary of Agriculture was he gathered a band of Cossacks and he began to sort of crisscross around Eurasia, appearing on the hinterlands of Russian, Chinese, and Japanese territory, and getting everybody very nervous as to what his intentions were. He may have wanted to eventually storm Tibet and sort of install himself as a lama, something like that. It was all unclear. But Wallace brought an end to the mission very abruptly, and that led to a very sharp falling out between Wallace and Nicholas Roerich's organization. That may have led to members of the Roerich Circle leaking those Dear Guru letters to the press, and thereby really diminishing Wallace's political career. So there's a real tragic aspect to this. When I was writing Occult America, I would have to say that Henry Wallace was probably the figure for whom I had experienced the greatest sense of discovery, felt a sense of admiration, sense of tragedy mixed with heroism. I think Wallace was a truly great man. And one of the things I loved so much about him was the absolute lack of embarrassment that he demonstrated in his interest in pursuing occult and esoteric studies. And people used to make fun of him for it. You know, there was one advisor to FDR who said, "Don't dare bring in a theosophist to see Henry. He'll give him a job like that." And, you know, people would say things like that about Wallace. But he was unembarrassed by his spiritual search. And I think one of the tragedies of his life, and one that I really relate to, is that he was unable to understand, as I am often unable to understand, that people would not really be able to grasp the seriousness, the maturity, the dedication that he brought to his search, even if it went in directions that might seem strange to the general public. So there was an unguardedness about Wallace, you know, where he would write these letters, these Dear Guru letters to Nicholas Roerich. And obviously he had cause to regret that later in life. And yet at the same time, I suppose he was unable to see, and I'm guilty of this myself, that other people, onlookers, couldn't fully grasp or understand the seriousness of his search, even if he was very transparent, very upfront, very straightforward about it. that was part of Wallace's idealism in a way. Maybe it didn't suit him to politics. It's part of why I find him such a great man.
Alfredo has a question. Whose world order are we living in right now? Ours or China's?
I was going to say Jeff Bezos's and Mark Zuckerberg's, but well, that's a hell of a question. That's really whose world order are we living in now, ours or China's? As somebody whose work has been censored in China, I'm not sure I want to know the answer to that question. It's a heavy question. My book, One Simple Idea, is a history of the positive mind movement, and I was thrilled years ago to learn that a Chinese publisher was interested in purchasing the rights to the book, um, translating it into Mandarin, and selling it in mainland China. And I thought, wow, this is really exciting, And I spent hours on Skype calls, much like this one, with a translator who lived in the city of Shanghai. And she was translating the book, and she was asking me for help with the translation. And it was a very interesting process because in a society that's officially atheistic, there are terms and references that are very easy and very common for us that are not understood by a person who lives in Shanghai, China today. And it's very difficult culturally to cross that gap. So, for example, we might make reference to the soul, and even if we don't do a great job of defining it, we all have some sort of idea of what's being stated. But you say that to an educated person in China, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" It was a very unusual and educative process. And the publisher asked me to write a new foreword for the Chinese readers, kind of spelling out, what is this new thought movement? What is this positive mind stuff? And I was so excited. But then the censorship man came along, and the publisher, as publishers will do in China, um, submitted the book to government censors prior to publication. And I was told, not reading Chinese, I can't verify it firsthand, but I was told that government censors removed more than 30% from the book. And the 30% that they removed are references to the idea of human beings having an extra physical existence, the idea of there being possibly a power associated with thought or with the psyche that goes beyond the physical. Those ideas are verboten within the Chinese Communist Party. The idea is that we live in a materialist world where the forces and the realities that define a person's life are economic, are nationalistic, are historical, not connections to some other world or other dimensions. That is a very dangerous displacement of power in a certain sense. If you say to the individual, there's a different you. There's not just this flesh and bone you that's subject to outer material laws, but there's a different you that's part of a much greater sense of the cosmic, that's interdimensional, that's possibly subject to internal recurrence, that's part of a history that's much vaster and greater than the history that we've understood. Those ideas are verboten. So, for me, that was kind of a shocking experience because I didn't think anything I was saying in the book was controversial. It certainly wasn't controversial here, but it was in China. So, I mean, look, I see what's going on in the world the same way that you do, and the locus of economic power is probably shifting in that direction, and there aren't institutions like the ones I've been describing, and so what can I say? I'm concerned about the question of free expression on all levels. So that's not a question that helps me sleep easy at night, because I think free expression and the protection of the spiritual search, the search for meaning, what else makes life worth living?
Well, Mitch, uh,
Oh, I think there was one more question there.
Yes, Cynthia says, so how does the Chinese government
Yeah,
explain
yeah, yeah. Well,
UFOs?
that's a
Our
really good question.
government
Yeah,
is now investigating.
yeah.
There was an article in the New Yorker a
I read
couple
that.
of weeks ago. Yeah,
Yeah, I read that.
please
That's a
comment.
fascinating article. I liked that article because I thought that article was fair. Barbara's referencing an article that just appeared in the New Yorker that talks about how the U.S. government, how the Pentagon came back around to studying UFOs, and it's one of these articles that you wouldn't have seen 2 years ago. The place like the New Yorker would not have taken seriously, would not have vested sufficient seriousness in the UFO question, which deserves a great deal of seriousness, to have written an article that was as reasonably straightforward as that article was. Because China is so closed as society, we don't know, we don't have any particular way of knowing, the extent or the depth of their study of UFOs. But there's no question that if the United States is now dedicating renewed resources to the study of UFOs and has in private for a long time, and there will be a report that the Department of Defense is actually releasing publicly next month in June, an unclassified report that supposedly is going to expound on some of what it's found in its previous search for UFOs. And now there's a new DoD-funded office that is studying UFOs. I can't fathom that this is not going on in China. This is not going on in Russia. It's certainly going on among some of the governments of South America. The nation of Brazil, for example, their military has been studying UFOs for many, many decades and doing so quite publicly. I think our generation is on a precipice because I think that the data in support of the existence of UFOs as engineered phenomena is so incontrovertible that I think it's impossible for any serious person in our society today, whoever they are, just to completely dismiss questions of little green men and swamp gas. I mean, ours is an age in which the UFO thesis has been validated, and I think that's very important.
We have two more questions, Mitch.
Sure.
One, how will the Kybalion, you're writing a book on it,
The Kybalion.
change our lives in 2021?
Oh, well, I certainly hope it will. Our documentary on the Kybalion is complete, and it's coming out, I expect, in fall of this year. What's so valuable about the Kybalion as a book, it sort of lines up with what I was saying about psycho-cybernetics as a book, and that is that the Kybalion is probably the greatest popularization of Hermetic spirituality that's ever been written. And a lot of people get caught up in the drama of the Kybalion because, the byline is this mysterious three initiates. Who are the three initiates? And as I've written elsewhere, I have a Kybalion study guide that I've published and other things. The writer of the book was William Walker Atkinson, who was a brilliant Chicago-based lawyer and prolific New Thought writer and philosopher who produced the book in 1908. He identified himself in later records, including an entry in Who's Who in America, as the sole author of the book, and it fit the pattern of his life because he would frequently
Mitch, you froze
use
up
pseudonyms.
just at the time you were telling us that. So would you say that last part over?
Oh, sure, yeah. William Walker Atkinson, who was a very prolific New Thought writer and philosopher and lawyer who lived in Chicago, he wrote the Kybalion, as he later attested himself, exclusively and by himself, and published it in 1908 as part of his Yogi Publication Society. He often wrote under pseudonyms. He used the pseudonym Magus Incognito, maybe not the most imaginative ever, and of course the pseudonym Yogi Ramasharka. And Three Initiates was probably his most popular pseudonym, although he used it only once in the writing of the Kybalion. And I used to dismiss the Kybalion. Years ago I thought, this is just some early 20th century novelty of occultism that's pretending to be a great ancient book of wisdom. But I was wrong. I later re-encountered the book, and there was one summer where I read it over multiple times, and I came to realize it really, really is a good, solid psychological popularization of Hermetic spirituality, at least, based upon the fragments that have come down to us. And I think it's a hugely useful book, and I think it helps settle some contradictions that exist within New Thought, such as, if my mind is ultimately powerful, then why am I so pressed by limits? You know, the Kybalion deals with some of the issues that we as individuals face within this concentric dimensional circle or reality within which we live, which may place us in a somewhat disadvantaged position, but that does not mean that we don't have a metaphysical existence. And I think the Kybalion provides some very practical methods in that regard. I have a book out now called the Kybalion Study Guide, and if you're interested in this, I encourage you to take a look at it, because it's the full text of the Kybalion with my own commentaries and suggested exercises and suggestions of how to read the Kybalion hand in hand with reading good translations of Hermetic literature. So you're really studying both this modern popularization and some of the fragments of ancient literature that have come to us.
And here's a question from Treat. Can you comment on the idea of the Count Saint Germain influencing our U.S. founders at the signing?
Oh, yeah, that's an idea I write about pretty extensively in my book, One Simple Idea. There was a story, oh boy, I'm going to try to state this very, very briefly. A story got circulated and repeated by Manly P. Hall that there was a mysterious master of wisdom who encouraged the signers of the Declaration of Independence. That story, Manly Hall was a great man. His historicism was not always as rigorous as it should have been. That was a fictional story that was written by a writer in the mid-19th century named George Lippard, who was a friend of Edgar Allan Poe's, who acknowledged that he was inventing the story, but he felt that the story captured some of the idealism of the era. In any case, Manly P. Hall repeated the story as fact in The Secret Teachings of All Ages, repeated it again as fact in his book The Secret Destiny of America, which was written in 1944. And The Secret Destiny of America inspired a young, or maybe at that time not so young, Hollywood actor named Ronald Reagan, who began his own political career in the 1950s and eventually, I'm told, did very well. And the reason I bring in Reagan is because I made a discovery in 2010, which was I found that in some of Reagan's talks and speeches, including from very early in his political career up through his presidency, he was using references and exact phraseology from the work of Manly P. Hall. And I discovered that Reagan was retelling this story of a mysterious master of wisdom, not necessarily Saint Germain, but some master of wisdom, although sometimes it's identified as Saint Germain, at the signing of the Declaration. And Reagan never fully indicated his belief in the story, but he said, he never verified it, but he too thought it did a good job of capturing some of the idealism of the time. So if you look at my book, One Simple Idea, you'll get the full story of that. It was very rewarding to me because it's so interesting to discover that there was, in fact, a connection between an esoteric figure like Manly P. Hall and so very public a figure like Ronald Reagan. It's actual history, and so when I say that there's a real occult history, I'm not kidding.
Well, there are no other questions. I'm turning
you
this
all.
over to Doss.
Okay. Mitch, that was great.
Thank you.
I just want to thank
you.
you
Appreciate it.
from all of us.
Appreciate it.
Given us a lot to think about, and we will remember this meeting for a long time, I'm sure.
Very good to be here, and always wonderful to be in exchange with brother and sister Theosophists, and I thank you.
Marcia, you have something?
Is it possible? Wow, that's nice. Sorry. Okay, can you hear me?
Thank you, Maria.
Oh, there I go. I don't know what happened to me. Would it be okay if I took a picture of the group so people who aren't on, if you want to get on, and so we have it for our history?
Fine with me.
Okay, fine with everybody. If you want to be on, you show
John, Cynthia, Janice.
yeah. We appreciate that. Okay, anybody else? What about John?
And if you
My
send
beard is pointing up, so my bird is better.
Okay. We'll know who it is, though, won't we? The wise owl. Okay, I'm going to take it, so. Smile. Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Marcia.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Well,
I'll
thank
send
you
it out.
guys. I've recorded everything, and Barbara, I will send probably tomorrow all 4 recordings to you. They'll be clearly marked. And thank you again. I really enjoyed this time with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Appreciate
much.
it. Thank you. Thank you. I'm back at you. Thanks very much. Thank you, Das.
Barbara,
Thank you,
we're gonna
Barbara.
we're gonna have the formal closing, and we're gonna close as we started with the old hidden life. So if Barbara would put that up there, this will be our grand finale. And after I read, I'm just gonna read this, and everybody think it along with me. And then we're gonna take about a minute for just meditation and silence. And then that will be it. I want the people who